order in a quorum call.
Just ask consent to speak or to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise tonight to speak about the voting legislation that we're debating on the floor. And like so many of my Democratic colleagues, I rise along with those Democratic colleagues in calling for comprehensive federal legislation to turn back the avalanche of voter suppression legislation in various states. All of it animated by the big lie about the 2020 election. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But it's clear to me that Republican politicians across the nation, in state capitals and even here in Washington, are attempting to make it harder for tens of millions of Americans to register to vote, to cast their vote, and they're even making it harder, of course, for every vote to count. This is a subversive threat. It's a subversive threat to our democratic institutions. I believe it's a clear and present danger to our elections, and also a clear and present danger to our stability as a nation. And of course, it's a clear and present danger and a direct threat to our democracy itself. Just by way of a significant example, consider what happened in just one state in the last couple of years, in Pennsylvania. I'll start with a historical backdrop. Pennsylvania, like a lot of states, had a high water mark of voting in 1960 in the election between John F. Kennedy and Richard M. Nixon. And then in 1964, the numbers were very high as well. So in 1960, right at almost exactly 70% of the voting age population voted. But after 1960 and 64, you had a precipitous drop that occurred every 4 years. Some years it would go up a little higher, other years it would go back down. But we never got in 60 years to that level again. So for example, just the most recent two elections before 2020 in Pennsylvania, the 2012 election, 5.74 million people voted. That was 57% of the voting age population. So down from that high water mark of 70% in 1960. 2016 was a big turnout in our state. We had more voters than 2012. It was 6.1 million voters, and it went from 57 in 2012 to 61. So it got over that 60 mark, but of course 61 is not 70, so we got nowhere near, even in 2016, when you look at the percent of the voting age population. So that's the backdrop of 2016, big turnout, but not the turnout level we saw in 1960 or 64 or a few other years. Then in October of 2019, and this is just an example of why the voting measures we're debating here are important in a positive way for helping people to vote. In October of 2019, Governor Tom Wolf in Pennsylvania signed Act 77. This was a historic and comprehensive election reform bill that sailed through the General Assembly with strong bipartisan support. Consider this, 133 Republicans voted for this bill. When you add up the number who voted in the state Senate for this bill, who were Republicans, and then you add them to the number in the state House, who were Republicans, voted for the bill. When you look at it across the whole General Assembly, both parties, both houses, about 70% of the General Assembly voted for it. So there's a lot of give and take and a lot of compromise, and they voted on a strong election reform bill. Remember, that was October of 2019, well before the onset of the pandemic. But thank goodness that we had that bill in place during the pandemic. In addition to enhancing election security, the Pennsylvania law, so-called Act 77, established, quote, no excuse, unquote, absentee voting, better known today as mail-in voting. And that applied to all voters. So finally we had a mechanism that people could vote by mail especially in a pandemic. But of course, when they voted on the bill in 2019, no one could have predicted how useful this legislation would be just a year later. This law was passed before COVID, but of course it was in the face of a once-in-a-century pandemic during the run-up to the 2020 election, but it proved to be, of course, particularly important. Now we get to 2020. So we have, over many, many years, many, many presidential elections, nowhere near the percent of the voting age population voting in a presidential election compared to 1960 and 64. What happened in 2020? In the middle of a pandemic, when everyone was predicting, in my home state of Pennsylvania, but other places as well, that turnout's going to be low because people are worried. They're worried about, and this is of course before vaccines, worried about contracting the virus. So they won't vote, the turnout's going to be low, and we'll see what happens. Well, it didn't happen that way. In Pennsylvania, in 2020, 6.9 million people voted. 6.9 million people. That's an increase of roughly 800,000 votes from just 4 years earlier. And that was a pretty good turnout, really good turnout in 2016. That 6.9 million votes amounted to 71% of the voting age population in Pennsylvania, which was a point higher than 1960. No one thought that was possible. The only way it was possible was because we had better voting procedures in place. So in other words, if you look at it not just from 16 to 20, but even from the most recent election before 16, 2012, the 2012 election to the 2020 election from 2012 was a 20% increase in voter turnout. So there can't be any dispute that Pennsylvania's record-setting 71% turnout was made possible only through expanding opportunities to vote for all voters, young and old and so many others in between. Mail-in voting enabled almost 3 million Pennsylvanians to safely and securely cast their ballot. By any measure, Pennsylvania should be celebrated as a success story of why these voting provisions help people vote. I hope that we never fall below that 71% of the voting age population. That ought to be the standard for voting in a pandemic or not. In fact, that number should go higher when we're outside of a pandemic because people have different ways to vote. A Republican-controlled legislature and a Democratic governor came together and enacted strongly supported bipartisan election reform legislation to increase election security and ballot access. Unfortunately, we know that the story doesn't end there. We all know what happened in the next chapter, and it's not unique to Pennsylvania. In response to the 2020 election, we've seen a new chapter, one focused on election subversion and voter suppression, written in state houses across the country. Again, it's attributable to the big lie about the 2020 election. Now, I want to note for the record that when we voted here on January the 6th, the evening of January the 6th, 2020, after the violent insurrection in the Capitol, where you had people marching through this building, calling for the death of the Vice President and trying to locate members of Congress to bring them harm, and also the whole effort was directed at stopping the counting of the electoral votes. But I want to note for the record that a number of Republican senators, in fact, most Republican senators, stood up on January the 6th that evening to vote to certify the election. Unfortunately, since January the 6th of 2020, despite having voted the right way for democracy that night, a lot of these Republican senators since then have only validated the big lie. So they may have voted the right way that night for our democracy, but since that time they haven't disputed the big lie enough, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, and of course now they've at least turned a blind eye to efforts at the state level that I just spoke of. I think it's also important for the record to note, Mr. President, I won't read all of this, but to note what the Associated Press found about the election of 2020. Here's a copy, and I'll ask consent to enter into the record an Associated Press story entitled, "Far Too Little Vote Fraud to Tip Election to Trump, AP Finds," dated December the 14th, 2021 by Christina A. Cassidy.
Without objection, will be entered into the record.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will just read the first graph of this Associated Press story, dated December of this past year. Quote, "An Associated Press review of every potential case of voter fraud in the 6 battleground states disputed by former President Donald Trump has found that fewer than 475, a number that would have made no difference in the 2020 presidential election," unquote. And of course, Pennsylvania was one of those states that they looked at. So we know what happened in the election, and we know why we can say with certainty that the big lie is nothing but a lie. After the election of 2020, in June of 2021, Pennsylvania's Republican-controlled legislature became one of the many legislatures across the nation passing a voter suppression law. Here's what they would have done if they were successful. They passed it, and this bill would have imposed unconstitutional voter ID restrictions, restricted mail-in voting. The mail-in voting they just voted in favor of in 2019, these same legislators. And this bill would essentially have eliminated the use of drop boxes. Furthermore, it rolled back several successful provisions of the Bipartisan Act 77, including reducing the number of days permitted to register to vote and eliminating an option to opt in to receive an annual mail-in ballot. While this bill was fortunately vetoed by Governor Wolf, the threat to suppress the vote in Pennsylvania remains ever present as the legislature continues to work on another omnibus election bill. So once again, the big lie animates the work of Republican politicians in Pennsylvania and throughout the country. And it's not simply a lie, it's a lie that engenders fear. Sometimes fear of losing your election in a primary. We understand that fear. We've seen it play out here as well. But sometimes the fear is deeper than that your own security will be at risk if you don't espouse the big lie. In light of these efforts, it is fair to question, how did Pennsylvania go from a shining example of bipartisan election reform in 2019 to ground zero in the fight against voter suppression and election misinformation in 2021 and continuing into 2022? In the months leading up to the 2020 general election, the former president led an assault on our election system, sowing seeds of division and, without evidence, questioning the legitimacy of voting methods, including mail-in voting, which has been utilized in the nation for decades. And by the way, mail-in voting allowed us to set a turnout record, as I said before, in Pennsylvania for the first time in 60 years to go that high of the voting age population. The former president lost his election to President Joe Biden, but instead of honorably conceding the race, he created the big lie that the election had been stolen from him by raising unfounded allegations of voter fraud, election irregularities in Pennsylvania and across the nation. Of course, there's simply no evidence to justify these claims of widespread voter fraud or irregularities suggested in the AP story in their investigation that undergirds their conclusions supports that. The big lie is the fraud. If you want to talk about fraud, that's where it is. That is the fraud. The big lie is the falsehood and the con job. It's a deliberate, ongoing attempt to sow instability. We know that in over 60 cases in court after court, from state courts to district courts to circuit courts to the U.S. Supreme Court, all those courts refuse to indulge the unprecedented, loopy legal arguments and false conspiracy theories were put forward by the president's campaign and some Republicans after the election. Despite the lack of any evidence to support claims of widespread fraud, we continue to hear these baseless conspiracy theories and calls to roll back Pennsylvania's Act 77 for one reason and one reason only: to disenfranchise voters. So in order to please one man, rather than support positive reforms that worked in Pennsylvania, that increased turnout in Pennsylvania exponentially like no other law has, lawmakers have introduced all over the country now some 400 voter suppression bills. There are three types of corrupt proposals that I would like to summarize. Number one, shifting election authority. That's one measure of a corrupt practice. Number two, attacking election workers. That's corrupt, and that's what they're trying to do. And number three, restricting mail-in voting. First and foremost, many of the bills attack the most fundamental, foundational element of our democracy: administering our elections. According to a report from Voting Rights Lab in September of 2021, more than 180 of the bills introduced across the country are an effort to subvert our current election administration. Some of these bills would allow the legislature or other partisan actors, really purveyors of the big lie, to exert greater control over elections and interfere with local election administrators. For example, Georgia's Senate Bill 202, which has already been enacted into law, not just proposed, this law will allow a partisan state election board to remove and replace local election administrators. The new law empowers the state legislature to appoint the chair of the election board, ensuring that the majority of the board reflects the partisan will of the legislature. We've also seen numerous lawmakers, including in Pennsylvania, initiate or attempt to initiate partisan election, quote, audits, unquote, into the 2020 election results without any evidence of fraud. The better word for this type of approach is frauded. That's what it is. It's a fraudulent attempt, and it is nothing more than a fraud. These efforts, fueled by the big lie, have wasted millions of taxpayer dollars, money solely in an attempt to further call into doubt the 2020 election and create instability in our elections. Republican efforts to shift election authority undermines people's faith in elections, and it injects partisanship into our election administration. The second area of corruption we've also seen in some of these bills is efforts to pass legislation that would create or increase civil and criminal penalties against election workers. Election officials across the nation, Republicans and Democrats alike, from blue counties and red counties, should be accorded the respect and commendation they deserve. These are public servants. They should not be subjected to threats, either legal or otherwise. In the middle of a pandemic, these same Americans risked their own health and their families' health to ensure that the elections were conducted safely and efficiently. These Americans, Republicans and Democrats and independents, did their job honorably. Rather than receiving appreciation for their efforts, they and their families have been threatened with threats of violence, fueled by the deliberate falsehoods of which I spoke before. The same falsehoods spread by politicians here in Washington and in state legislatures across the country. These threats were particularly relevant in my home state of Pennsylvania, when then Philadelphia Commissioner Al Schmidt, a Republican, his family and his colleagues were subjected to death threats for doing their job. This is a Republican elected official in Philadelphia subjected to death threats after Election Day, simply because he was trying to fulfill, and the others that worked with him are trying to fulfill, an essential part of their basic duty, which is counting the votes in that city. So despite the widely reported threats against our election officials and concerns about mass resignations due to the stresses on our democratic institutions, Republican legislatures have enacted laws that further threaten these officials with felony prosecutions, and they also threaten civil penalties for noncompliance with election rules, even inadvertent or technical mistakes. We've never seen this before, Mr. President, in America, but that's what we're talking about today. So these attacks are a clear attempt to further undermine our democracy and counter the efforts of many election officials to help make voting safer and easier during the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, the third issue, which I would consider a corrupt practice that's embedded into these bills, is the question of mail-in voting. As I've already shared, Pennsylvania's record turnout in 2020, it was a direct result of the bipartisan efforts, 133 Republican legislators voting for mail-in balloting so that we would have universal mail-in voting and early voting in addition to mail-in voting. Rather than embracing its success, Republican lawmakers in Pennsylvania and across the country have worked to greatly restrict or eliminate mail-in voting through a variety of methods. 7 states have reduced the time frame in which voters can request mail-in ballots. Another 4 states limited the use of ballot drop boxes. Some states have gutted or even tried to gut the ability of voters to automatically register to receive a mail-in ballot for every election they're eligible to vote in. Republican politicians just keep on lying about the 2020 election. Not a single Republican politician has come forward with evidence of the type of widespread systemic voter fraud that would necessitate any of the changes that these laws are predicated on and these proposals are predicated on. In reality, these changes are about one thing and one thing only: making it more difficult to cast a ballot. Every single American should be alarmed by these efforts. If we allow voter suppression efforts to go unchecked, they'll eventually and simply impact everyone. I think it was Martin Luther King who talked about injustice, an injustice that would be validated by these corrupt proposals. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Voter suppression efforts make it harder. Just a couple of examples in my home state, and this is true of a lot of states. Voter suppression laws make it harder for a 90-year-old living in rural Pennsylvania who can't get to her county election bureau to vote or to a polling place. She'll have a harder time voting in Pennsylvania and every other state if Pennsylvania goes in the direction of some of these other states. Pennsylvania has over 800,000 veterans who fought for our freedoms, including the right to vote, the freedom to vote. Shouldn't that veteran continue to have the option to vote early or to vote by mail after they've served our nation? Shouldn't they continue to have that option? Or should we just go back to the old ways where that veteran is limited to 1 day a year for a certain number of hours a year to vote in a general election? So these proposals, these voter suppression and subversion proposals, will impact everyone. It'll impact a farmer in Pennsylvania who might have a very busy day on election day and can't get to vote for one reason or another. So if they're not able to vote, their vote gets canceled out because we decided not to have early voting, which we have now. We decided not to have mail-in ballots, which we have now. All in service of one man and one big lie. That's what this is all about. So we can't go back to those days. How about just another example from Pennsylvania? We've had a long tradition where men and women serving overseas have voted by absentee ballot. Guess what an absentee ballot is? An absentee ballot is a mail-in ballot. It's the same thing. We just broaden the category of folks who could use that same method. So do we want to go back to a time when we can't have the kind of mail-in ballots that we had in 2020 that led to that great turnout? And it's entirely possible we could go back to a time when even the votes of men and women serving overseas would be put at risk. Because when you eliminate mail-in ballots in a state like Pennsylvania, you're eliminating absentee ballots as well by doing that. So I don't think we want to do that to our fighting men and women. So we can't go back to the days when farmers and small business owners and veterans and busy moms juggling their kids' schedules and seniors who may have trouble voting and need another option to vote. We can't go back to those days when they couldn't vote if they didn't have the time on that one single day. It's one of the reasons why we had such low voter turnout, even in presidential elections for all these years in Pennsylvania and so many other states. So we know what we have to do. We have to go back to our founding principles, and voting is a foundational pillar of our democracy. And as elected officials, it's our responsibility to do all we can to expand voter access and remove institutional barriers to voting. But we've got to be clear about what's happening. Our democracy, by virtue of these suppression bills, is under siege right now. The attack here on January the 6th continues. What was a violent attack on that day is now in the form of legislation to attack our elections, to attack the right to vote, to make it harder to vote. So attacking democracy at an earlier stage was always met by the right response. Today, that right response, the correct response, is to pass the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act to prevent these kinds of attacks on voting rights. It would protect election officials by criminalizing intimidation, threats, or coercion of election officials. It would mandate systematic, nonpartisan, risk-limiting audits to combat against the unfounded partisan approaches by Republicans. It would create national standards for early voting, mail voting, voting restoration, voter identification, and voter registration. It would also include some of the provisions of my bill, the Accessible Voting Act, to create an accessible voting experience for every voter, ensuring that the needs of people with disabilities are met. That's another category of Americans whose votes will be suppressed, people with disabilities, if these Republicans get their way. This bill we're trying to pass reflects feedback from state and local officials to ensure that people responsible for implementing these reforms can do so effectively. Furthermore, we restore the full strength of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 after the Supreme Court gutted the voting rights, several of the Voting Rights Act provisions in recent years. These provisions work hand in hand to improve access to the ballot and protect against election subversion. We should restore the Senate at the same time by allowing plenty of time for debates, as well as a robust amendment process, so the minority party in the Senate has a full opportunity to debate issues like voting rights. So, Mr. President, we got to do more than just simply move a bill forward tomorrow on voting rights. We should also change the Senate rules appropriately to allow that bill to be passed by a majority after we have a robust debate. Debating voting rights has never been more important. The time to do that is now. Madam President, I would yield the floor.